Welcome to Sovereign Finance, the show that connects the dots between personal finance, global finance trends, and deep human history. Tune in every week to demystify the money puzzle and protect your interests in a turbulent world. Welcome to the Sovereign Finance Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Drummond, here as always with Derek Dearden. How is it going, Derek?
Good. Thanks, Rob. And you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Today we're going to cover an introduction to cryptocurrencies, which is a topic that I, for one, am excited to learn about. I think there's a lot of people in this boat of either they've dabbled with it or heard about it, or someone else has decided to invest lots of money in it. So yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, well, I think the best place to start is what problem is cryptocurrencies attempting to solve, and how well does it address those problems? So effectively, the starting point is that, as we've discussed before, the fiat currencies which we use around the world, pounds, dollars, euros, anything else, have got various drawbacks. And the most extreme drawback I think we're all aware of and constantly being reminded of is that these are constantly being subject to inflation, is one way of putting it. I would put it more bluntly and say they're being continually debased by the issuing of more and more currency by banks and without doing anything for it. The other problem is that there are about 160,000 different currencies in the world, and a lot of those are virtually impossible to use or even exchange without a great deal of difficulty and overhead expense in anywhere other than their home jurisdiction. And any time that any of us is buying or selling something to an area with a different currency, we're involved in a sometimes quite extortionate commission charge for changing between the currency. So
it's not a level playing field, in other words, is it?
It's not a level playing field. I think if you go back to the discussion we had about what money actually is, at its most basic level, it's an exchange of value, which if it's an honest exchange of value, is it essentially an exchange of work done by one person with an amount of work done by another, an exchange of their time in purposeful creative activity of some sort or another. And the problem with counterfeiting is that somebody is acquiring for themselves this means of exchange without themselves doing any work. So that's a form of theft. And to put it bluntly, that's what banks do every time they create some fresh money. And of course, the issue with that is that the quantity of money is continually being enlarged. So if we look at cryptocurrencies, and I'm going to be talking specifically about Bitcoin, because from the investigations I've done, I cannot see that any of the alternative cryptocurrencies which have come and gone, and many of which are still around, but some have crashed spectacularly. I cannot see that any of them actually add anything to what Bitcoin itself provides. And in fact, I would say that in one way or another, they're all retrograde steps in some way or another. Of course, other people might disagree with me, and that would be a more detailed debate for another time.
I think what you can't argue with is that Bitcoin appears to be like the £100 gorilla in the marketplace.
It absolutely is, yeah. And we'll look at what it is about that. One of the things is that there is an absolute hard limit in the mathematics involved of 21 million bitcoins, which is the the ceiling that uh, that is set by the inherent mathematics of it. And in fact, over 19 million of those have already been mined, as it's called, and I'll look into what's involved in the mining process. Another thing about it is that it's completely transparent in that the software to generate the bitcoins and to check the transactions on the network is open source. So anybody with the relevant computer knowledge and cryptographic knowledge and mathematical knowledge can actually both look at the underlying algorithms and also look at the implementation of those as being used and check that it's right. Now, of course, most people can't do that, but many hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of competent computer enthusiasts have picked over this code and examined it and come to the conclusion that it is entirely robust. So it's for any other user, it's a question of taking it on trust. And taking technology on trust is something we all do every day. We do it with our computers. We assume that when we receive an email message that it comes from the person it's supposed to have come from, and it says what they typed. Of course, that's not always the case, but most of the time it is, and there are various ways of verifying it if you've got any doubt about it. When you get in a car, you assume that the designer of that car knew what they were doing and put everything together so that it would work, or when you fly in an aeroplane and all the rest of it. So it's much the same with not necessarily needing to know yourself all of the details. But what we'll cover on this call is a bit of an overview, which I hope will strike a reasonable balance between getting too involved in the technicalities and should be understandable to any normal person. Any queries so far?
No, my initial query, I think, it might be a starting point into the conversation, but I think a lot of people kind of view currency as essentially digital anyway, in that they have money in the bank, it's accessible online, they can transfer money to people, they can pay for stuff in effect digitally. So how is this all different?
Right.
I mean, you mentioned some things about the transparency, I guess.
Well, of course, the point is that in order for that to operate, somebody has to maintain a ledger of what those transactions are. And in this case, it's the bank. And people outside the bank don't know anything about what's in the bank's ledgers. Whereas on the Bitcoin network, there are what are called nodes. Everybody who holds some Bitcoin and does any transactions in Bitcoin is a node. And in theory, any node can verify the transactions up to date. And then there are a far smaller number of people who are Bitcoin miners, as it's called. And the analogy is that with mining gold, it takes a lot of effort and energy to mine the gold, and that restricts the supply of it. I mean, I don't think it's a very good analogy anyway, because with the gold, there's a certain amount in the world. There's not a great deal relative to that, which is coming into the pool on a day-by-day basis from the miners. As indeed, I guess you could say that's the parallel with Bitcoin, because in the early days of it, it was quick and easy to mine, and 50 new Bitcoins were generated every time a block was generated, which happened roughly about every 10 minutes. And that was given to the miner, and that was why they did that. Although in the early days it was an article of faith that they'd ever be worth anything. And we'll track that sequence of events a bit in future. Now, every 4 years, roughly, it started out that successfully mining a block was rewarded with 50 bitcoins. And then after 4 years, that halved, so it was 25. And after another 4, it was halved again, so it's 12 and a half. And every 4 years since then, it's halved again. And there's another halving coming up now. So, and this is how it will gradually approach the actual maximum number that can be in circulation. So now that there are not so many bitcoins to be had by creating a new block, most of the income to the Bitcoin miners comes from transaction fees. So when somebody makes a transaction, and we'll look in a minute at the way that happens. When somebody makes a transaction, they have to make an allowance for an overhead of a fee that goes to the miner who verifies that block. And I'd like to just go into a little bit more about the way that the assurance is given of the validity of the transactions. Effectively, it's an error checking arrangement. Or rather, a block validation check, which is very similar. I mean, every time a message is transmitted over the internet, there is a whole series of calculations to verify that the message at the other end got through intact. And I'll explain how this works with communication, and then we'll relate it back to transactions. Suppose I send a message to you. Effectively, what the software under the hood does is it performs a mathematical calculation on the contents of that block of data, and the result of that calculation is a number which is appended to the end of the block. And then when your computer receives that, the receiving software does the same calculation on the block and checks that it's got the same number on the end. And if it hasn't, then something's been corrupted on in the course of the transmission, and there are various procedures then, like requesting a resend and so forth. Okay, so effectively, each time a new block is added to the blockchain, the contents of the block, which contain a heavily compressed summary of a few thousand Bitcoin transactions, is summed with the error checking that was at the previous block. So there's a single continuous thread, and at any given time, the miners are doing the calculations necessary to verify whether the current block, whether the next check digit that they're attempting to generate is valid or not. And when they do that, they add that to the end of the block. And there are various procedures for dealing with the situation where two miners come up with the next block simultaneously, and one or other of them will be validated. And then this is being constantly monitored by the many thousands of nodes on the network who are running the much easier checking procedure. So I'll just say another thing about cryptography in general that this rests on. We all know in general the notion of coded messages, and the whole point of a coded message is that both the sender and the receiver have a key which can be used to, at the sending end, scramble the message, and at the receiving end, unscramble it. And that, of course, is the weakness, in that they both have to have the same key. They either have to, at some point or another, have communicated and shared it, and then gone their separate ways, in which case there's a physical record of the key in existence, or they have to somehow or other send the key. And of course, by sending the key, that itself could be intercepted. And for instance, at the time of the Second World War, I think we know a certain amount about the success of Alan Turing and the Enigma program to decrypt the German encrypted messages. And part of, although it was very ingenious, the detective work, they also did in fact need some indication of various clues about the keys that were being used. And it turned out after the war that at various times, various code books um, had been captured, and this was certainly also the case with the Japanese naval codes, and of course also the fact that they managed to somehow or other get hold of one of the actual Enigma machines that the Germans were using for encrypting their messages. So, so that's a weakness that if the key is discovered by a third party, that third party can, and then that third party intercepts the message. They could decode it. And the breakthrough in more recent times has been what's called public key cryptography. And that's where there's a private key, which only the sender has, and a public key, which can literally be public. I mean, you could buy a classified advertisement in a newspaper and publish your key, or you could announce that the public key was going to be the headline in the first edition of the New York Times on a certain day, or whatever. But I mean, normally you wouldn't do that. You'd just send the public key to the person that you're trying to communicate with. You'd use your private key to encode the message, which nobody else has, and they would be able to decode the message with the public key. And that's effectively what is done with a Bitcoin transaction. Each person who owns some Bitcoin or some fraction of a Bitcoin has their own private key, which they keep secret. If they let anybody else know that, then that person could do transactions with their Bitcoin supply. But assuming that they keep that sufficiently secret, they can use that anytime they want to send some quantity of Bitcoin to another user. And so to send that, they would just send an address which they can generate from their private key, and a public key which they generate from their private key, and the amount that they want. The receiving person can use that public key to decode it, and then that amount of Bitcoin is transferred to them. And that information is published to the network, and the miners use that to generate the latest block in the chain. And there are, without going into a lot of details, because the checksum of that block is appended to the end of the block and is used as part of the seed for the following block, by the time another block has been added to the chain, it would be very difficult to fraudulently change a transaction in a previous block. And for normal purposes, and as I said, typically the way it works is that there's a new block being added to the chain every 10 minutes. So your transaction would be 3 deep after half an hour, or it would be 6 deep after another hour, and that's regarded as being adequate. Now,
and so the further back in the chain it is, the more kind of secure it comes.
Exactly so. And
it's worth reiterating that the blockchain, as it's called, kind of goes back.
Yes, it goes back to the original. Anybody setting up a node on their computer has to first of all go back to the original block and generate each block in the chain themselves up until the present time. And so every copy of the chain on every node is identical. So initially, it was possible.
So I guess the summary is it makes it quite a hard system to gain, like
Well,
potentially on very, very recent transactions. There's maybe a possibility, but those transactions recently become quickly buried.
well, as I say, after 30 minutes, the chances of generating an alternative block and a bunch of appendages, you would need more than half of the total computing power in the entire mining network in order to do that. So I think, as I say, that's probably enough that we can take it at face value that enough people have looked at this and it works as designed. Of course, it's always possible that some flaw may emerge at some point in the future, but it's vanishingly unlikely, especially since this has been running this length of time. And initially, it was easy enough to generate the original blocks on an ordinary laptop. By the time it had been running for a few years, it wasn't really realistic and you needed specialist hardware. And now, if you want to get into the mining game, you need a huge data center with these specialized bits of hardware to attempt to generate the new blocks. And that brings up to reservations that some people have that this is colossally wasteful on electricity, and I'll address those points a little bit later.
So let's maybe bring this back to like the individual business owner who has maybe heard of this. Like it feels like there's not a huge amount of transactions going on in cryptocurrency.
Well, essentially, the way to look at it is it's yet another currency, and as I pointed out, you could say that it's one of the 160,000 currencies in the world, to put it into perspective. And as probably anybody who's travelled has known, if you're travelling around anywhere you go, if you've got American dollars, you can probably readily translate those at a fairly reasonable exchange rate into whatever local currency is happening.
I did that in South America. Like I always had a reserve stash of dollars just for being stuck in the wilderness, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But very often people won't actually take the dollars, depending on where you are. They well, I remember trying to buy petrol in France with US dollars and getting a pretty dusty answer.
I got stuck in a place called Leme Bamba in northern Peru, which is a little village in the middle of the Andes, and I managed to exchange some. I forgot to take any Peruvian soles before before I went, and I managed to exchange some in an internet cafe of all places.
Well, anyway, I think pounds you can still exchange fairly readily most places. Euros you can, and I think euros is the fifth most readily exchangeable currency, and Bitcoin is certainly in the top 10. So that makes it kind of credible as from a foreign exchange standpoint. And like all foreign exchange transactions, I think there's a few things to look at here. One is that this is really, at best, speculation rather than investment. There isn't new wealth being created in a foreign exchange transaction, but somebody might have won and somebody might have lost in terms of what the value is the next day or the next hour or the next month, and because of that, there's a lot of the entire currency exchange market is over 95% speculative gambling, effectively, and and only a very small proportion of it is actually to settle transactions that were done cross-border, which is the whole point of having these things in the first place. And that is also the case with Bitcoin. But having said that, it's entirely possible that Bitcoin will come to be significantly used for purchases. I don't know who has any reliable data on what proportion of transactions are for purchases, but certainly people are buying and selling things. And that comes back to how Bitcoin became something with monetary value in the first place. The after I think nearly everybody knows the name Satoshi Nakamoto, who was the originator of the Bitcoin algorithms and the Bitcoin concept. Nobody knows whether that's a real single person or whether it's a group of people. Nobody knows whether or not he is Japanese, or whether he selected a Japanese name as a pseudonym. And there have been various theories speculating about who it might have been, but as far as I know, none of them are definitive. But anyway, he published on a cryptographic bulletin board the original paper about it in February 2009, and then a bunch of other people started mining bitcoins and accumulating Bitcoin totals. And in May 2010, the first actual transaction was made using Bitcoin, and somebody paid somebody else 10,000 bitcoins for two pizzas. So that put a value of a pizza at some small fraction of a cent, the value of a bitcoin at some tiny fraction of a cent at that time. And presumably it was easy come, easy go, because anybody who was mining them could do it on their laptop or desktop.
It was a lower barrier to entry for the mining game.
Yeah, and could accumulate significant balances. Now, 26th of April, 2024, the current value, ironically enough, is in the region of $64,000 per Bitcoin. So to do a transaction with a whole Bitcoin now it is a pretty large transaction. And of course, for all intents and purposes, that's far too large for anything in the way of a normal everyday transaction. And fractions of a Bitcoin are called sats, SATS, as an abbreviation of Satoshi. And there's 100 million of those in one Bitcoin. So we could work it out. I haven't got the figures right in front of me. But that basically is a manageable amount for a day-to-day transaction. I think we need to do the sums and monitor that as to how it would map if, as some people believe, Bitcoin is going to be the global transaction currency of the future. That strikes me as possibly implausible, but it could well be a foundational background against which other currencies are measured, and against which interbank clearing at the end of the day is done, for example, which would mean that we all had a record of the interbank transactions.
I mean, surely transacting would require like an internet connection and a device, and there's various barriers there, I think.
Well, as I said, for the miners, it needs a great deal of. It certainly does need, in practical terms, it does need an internet connection. Yeah, but in order to be able to send a quantity of money in Bitcoin or to receive it, it only needs an ordinary amount of computing power, and it only needs an ordinary amount of computer power to check and verify. And because it's a distributed network, it means no single person has control over the whole thing that we have to trust. That's the main point about it.
And the computing power could be say a smartphone, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a great many people do actually do transactions from their smartphone, and because because there's a significant fee involved in making a transaction which gets added to the blockchain, there have had to be alternative solutions to doing day-to-day transactions, and that's by having other layers on top of the Bitcoin network. The most commonly known one is one called the Lightning Network, and effectively what this does is that it allows for aggregating a whole bunch of small transactions, then making that a Bitcoin transaction which gets added to the blockchain. So it's not quite so immediately verifiable, but it seems to be gaining traction. It seems to be going well, and I think that would be a topic for another whole episode. So,
Would you recommend that someone listening maybe just goes through the process and buys 20 or
I
30
think
pounds of Bitcoin just to see how it works?
exactly. I think the only way to learn this is to take a small amount, which is not anything any. You're not betting a large proportion of your savings or assets on it, but you're putting a nominal amount of money that if the worst came to the worst and for any reason the Bitcoin value went to zero or the whole thing seized up and no longer was carrying transactions and became worth a lot less, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But the upside is considerable. I mean, if I think two things would completely transform the landscape. One is if a far larger percentage of the commercial transactions that are being done every day were done using Bitcoin. And the other is if there were a network of dealers in different parts of the world who were constantly providing the facility to exchange back and forth between Bitcoin and gold, because that would provide a stabilizing influence and damp down a lot of the speculation. Because if if there are dealers in different parts of the world all prepared to sell gold at an advertised price in Bitcoin or to buy gold at an advertised price in Bitcoin, it would mean that immediately there was arbitrage opportunities if these differed very widely. And I think that would have a stabilizing effect. That's just a piece of speculation that I've come up with. So,
I mean, it's worth reiterating, small down, at least in holding a small amount of Bitcoin, small downside if you might lose it, basically, potentially
yeah,
large upside if it does become more commonly used for transactional purposes.
exactly.
I would sum up my entire entrepreneurial journey as being a series of risks, if you like, that have small downside but potentially large upside if they turn off. If
Yeah,
if they come in, I think that's part of the entrepreneurial journey.
yeah,
Maybe this is another aspect of that.
yeah. And I think we've got an opportunity for people to comment on the Substack pages, haven't we? So I would suggest maybe if people have got any queries that they'd like answered, if they comment, if they add those in the comments, then we can run another episode at a later date. And there are various people I know who are far more knowledgeable about the details of this than I am, and perhaps we could get them on as guests on a future episode. What do you think?
I mean, just as follow up questions, like if someone was wanting to buy a small amount of Bitcoin, I think you would then need some wallet software. I think.
Well,
What's the best way of going about it?
all I'd like to say at this point is there's a variety of levels of involvement that you could have. I mean, the most extreme one is you could download the software, compile it, and run set yourself up as a node and run that. Most people, that involves too much technicality, too much thinking about it, too much involvement with things that they haven't necessarily got the specialized knowledge. So there are plenty of alternatives. I mean, the concept of a wallet is something that that deals with those levels of detail, and you can operate on a conceptual level. And I think, as a general rule, something which is not normally connected to the internet, and which you only connect to the internet at a time that you're doing transactions, would be a sound idea, just from perfectly general, perhaps over paranoid concern about having your devices hacked if you're continually online. And, I would say research those options yourself, talk to people who are already doing it, ask them what they're doing. I think it would be beyond the level of detail that I want to go into be offering anything that might be considered advice in that area.
No, I think this has been a good overview. Reiterate, if you've listened to this, you got questions, there's plenty of different directions we could take this in terms of follow-up discussions. So yeah, do leave a comment on the Substack.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sovereign Finance. For more episodes, transcripts, in-depth articles, and community, please take a minute now to subscribe free at sovereignfinance.substack.com. See you next time.